The candle at the top of the stairs had blown out. Henrietta McCarthy stood in the entrance hall of Ashworth, her traveling case at her feet, and 12 miles of winter dark behind her, and understood at once that no one had expected her to arrive. The footman who had opened the door held his lamp at the wrong height, the way men do when they are surprised in the middle of something else entirely, and the light caught the stone floor and the base of the grand staircase, and nothing much beyond. The house breathed cold around her. She could hear, somewhere above, the short, sharp cough of a child, and the shuffle of a nurse who did not know what to do about it. She had not yet removed her gloves when the voice came from the upper landing. "Who is it?" Not a question asked in welcome, a question asked in warning. The footman, whose name she would later learn was Graves, swallowed and said, "The new companion, Your Grace, for Master Thomas." The pause that followed was 3 full seconds. She counted them. "Send her back." Henrietta did not move. She stood with her hands clasped at her waist and her chin level and her eyes on the lamp Graves still held at the wrong height. And she thought, 12 miles. She thought. The posting inn at Carwell does not open its booking room before 6 in the morning. She thought, underneath both of those things, the thing she had been thinking for most of her 23 years, without quite putting it into words, which was this. She thought, I have been sent away before, and I have survived it. She was still thinking it when the child coughed again. This time the sound was wet and frightened, and 8 years old. She picked up her traveling case and started up the stairs. The story of how Henrietta came to Ashworth at all began, as most unwanted arrivals do, with a death and a letter. The death had been her father's, a clergyman of the old school, methodical and beloved and entirely without provision, who had gone quietly in the spring and left behind him a rectory that belonged to the living, and a daughter who belonged to nothing. The letter had arrived 4 weeks after, from a solicitor in London named Aldous Crane, representing the Duke of Ashworth, who required a companion of steady temperament for a young ward of 8 who had lately lost his nurse to illness and his governess to a better household. The post paid £32 a year and included room and board and the use of the small morning room for correspondence. The letter was not warm. It was not meant to be. It was precisely the sort of letter a man like the Duke of Ashworth, who she had been told was exacting and unsmiling, and not 4 years widowed, would send through his solicitor to a clergyman's daughter with no connections and no alternatives. She had accepted by return post. There was nothing else to accept. What she had not been told, and what she would not learn until later, was that Edmund Rayfield had not actually wished to hire anyone at all. He had wished to send Thomas to school at Harrow a full year early, on the grounds that a school was orderly and a house with a child in it was not. And it was only Crane's patient insistence, delivered in 3 separate memoranda, that a ward of 8 was too young for that particular institution that had produced the advertisement at all. Edmund had approved the solicitor's final choice of candidate without reading past the second line of her application. He had been in the East Wing at the time, standing in front of the portrait of his late wife, Ilara, which hung in the corridor between his study and the room he no longer used, and he had not been attending to letters. So when Henrietta arrived at Ashworth on a Wednesday night in November at 11:30, having ridden 12 miles in a borrowed carriage whose wheels needed attention, the Duke of Ashworth was in no mood for unexpected things. She found Thomas in the nursery at the end of the second-floor corridor. He was sitting up in his bed, with his knees drawn to his chest, and his face flushed in the particular way of a fever that is worried but not yet dangerous, and he was watching the door with the expression of a child who has been ill alone long enough to have given up expecting anyone. The nurse, a young woman called Betts, who was not quite equal to the situation, stood at the washstand, wringing a cloth and looking at Henrietta with undisguised relief. Henrietta set her traveling case in the corner. She took off her gloves and her outer mantle and draped them over the chair by the window, and she crossed to the bed and sat down on its edge and put the back of her hand to Thomas's forehead, which was hot enough to make her press her lips together. His eyes were the color of dark water. He did not flinch from her touch. "It hurts here," he said, pointing to his chest. "I know," she said. "We are going to do something about that." She sent Betts for a basin of cool water and a second blanket, and she asked for chamomile tea from the kitchen if anyone was still awake to make it, and she settled herself in the chair that she drew close to the bed and began to talk to Thomas in the low, even voice she had used with the children of the parish when they were frightened. She told him about the journey from Carwell, about the stars that had been visible for the last 4 miles where the road crossed the open heath, about the particular shade of dark blue the sky becomes just before the moon rises. Thomas listened with his eyes half closed and his breathing slowly easing. By 1 in the morning, his fever had dropped to something manageable, and he was asleep, one hand still curled around the edge of the blanket she had tucked around his shoulders. Henrietta did not leave. She was not sure afterward whether she had made a deliberate choice or whether she had simply been unable to make herself do the other thing, the sensible thing, the thing that obeyed orders and saved her from being out of a post before she had properly begun it. She knew only that the child slept, and that Betts had fallen asleep in the corner chair, and that the fire needed tending every 40 minutes, and that the room looked, in the small hours of the night, exactly like a room in which no one would know if she stayed or left. She stayed. She was reading by the light of a single candle, a slim volume of botanical essays she had carried in her traveling case, when she heard the door open behind her. She did not turn at first. She assumed it was Betts or one of the kitchen maids. Then the quality of the silence changed, and she understood it was not. He stood in the doorway for a long time before she turned. When she did, she saw a tall man in a dressing coat and riding boots, as though he had half undressed and half dressed again in the course of indecision. With dark hair and a jaw she would have called carved if she had been the kind of woman who thought in those terms. He was looking at the child. He was looking at the child with an expression she did not yet have the vocabulary to name, something between relief and a grief so old it had gone quiet. He looked at her. She looked at him. She said, "He is sleeping." The fever broke around 1 o'clock. He asked for water twice and settled again each time. He said nothing for so long that she began to feel the silence as a kind of physical weight. Then he said, "I gave orders for you to leave." "You did," she agreed. "The posting in at Carwell opens at 6. I intend to leave at first light if that remains your wish." His eyes moved to Thomas, then back to her. She held very still. "It is nearly 5, he said. "I know." He stood there a moment longer, and then he withdrew from the doorway without another word, and she heard his footsteps on the corridor floor, deliberate and slow, until they disappeared. She turned back to her book. Her hands were entirely steady. Her heartbeat was audible in her throat. No one came to send her away at first light. At 7, Graves appeared with a breakfast tray for Master Thomas and a smaller tray of tea and bread for the companion, with no message attached. She ate the bread and drank the tea and said nothing about it. And by 8 o'clock, Thomas was sitting up and asking about the botanical essays, and she was reading aloud to him from the chapter on winter heliotrope, and Ashworth had made its first quiet decision about her without saying a word. She was not, of course, simply allowed to remain. The household's understanding of her status was as unsettled as the weather in that first week, and she was aware, in the way a careful woman learns to be aware, of the glances exchanged over her head in the breakfast room, the way the senior staff deferred to her in Thomas's vicinity and looked past her in any other. Edmund himself she saw twice in that first week, once in the corridor outside the East Wing study, where he was holding a letter and reading it with the focused displeasure of a man who receives nothing but bad news, and once at the foot of the main stairs when she was coming down with Thomas for his afternoon walk in the grounds. Both times his gaze moved over her in the way one checks a fact one already knows, neither warm nor dismissive. If you have found yourself staying up late to watch this story unfold, you are in good company. A great many people are watching from exactly where you are. Leave a word in the comments if Henrietta's midnight decision feels familiar to you, and do stay, because the night she spent at Thomas's bedside has only just begun to cost her. It was Lady Dorothea Rayfield who made the situation perfectly plain. She arrived at Ashworth 3 weeks into November, with Cecily Vane at her right hand and a traveling party of 11, including a lady's maid who required a separate room and a footman whose sole function appeared to be the management of Lady Dorothea's morning correspondence. The Dowager Duchess was a woman of 61 who had organized her entire identity around the management of rank, and she had the particular poise of someone who has never been wrong about anyone's social worth, which is to say she had never tried. She swept through Ashworth's entrance hall with the confidence of a woman who still considered it her house, and when she encountered Henrietta coming down the main stair with Thomas, she stopped and looked at her in the way one looks at a piece of furniture that has been placed incorrectly. "Ah," said Lady Dorothea. "The companion." She said the word with a small, precise pause before it, the kind of pause that separated the thing from any possible pretension to being more. "We were given to understand there had been some difficulty in filling the post." "The post has been filled, my lady," Henrietta said. "So I see." Lady Dorothea's gaze moved to Thomas, then back. "You may take the boy to the garden. We will need the ground floor for the morning." She had been told, had Henrietta by 3 separate people in 3 separate ways, and this was the first. Cecily Vane delivered the second voicing 10 days later, at a small gathering in the drawing room that Lady Dorothea organized, with the stated purpose of introducing Ashworth's neighbors to the social arrangements of the coming winter assembly. Cecily was 20 years old, and so precisely dressed that every ribbon on her person appeared to have been positioned by an engineer. She spoke with the measured confidence of a woman who has been told from the cradle that she is the correct answer to every relevant question. She said to the woman beside her, loud enough to cross the width of the room, "I understand the companion has been here since autumn. These working arrangements are all very well, of course, but one does feel the household's proper order ought to take precedence once the season requires it." There was a murmur of agreement from the woman beside her. Henrietta, who was standing near the fire with a cup of tea she had not asked for, and a book she had not had time to open, set the cup down on the mantel and looked at the window. Outside, the grounds were gray, and the first hard frost of winter had crystallized every blade of grass in the lower garden into something that looked, from this distance, almost like lace. Edmund was in the room. He was standing at the far end, near the door to the east corridor, with a glass of claret he was not drinking. And when she looked at the window, she caught, at the edge of her vision, his head turning. She did not look at him. She excused herself and went to find Thomas. The season's machinery proceeded. Neighbors arrived for dinners. Lady Dorothea arranged the drawing room and the dining table. According to a map of precedence, Henrietta suspected she had been revising since Edmund's father died. Cecily Vane played the pianoforte after dinner, with accomplished elegance and smiled at Edmund with the particular smile of someone who has been told the match is practically settled. Edmund received the smile as he received everything, with a stillness so complete it gave nothing back. But there were other things Henrietta noticed, or did not permit herself to notice. He came to the nursery once in the early evening, when Thomas was well into a fever-free week, and the two of them were working through a Latin exercise at the small table by the window. Edmund stood in the doorway for a moment, before Thomas saw him. And in that moment, he watched his ward with an expression that was not coldness, precisely, and not warmth, precisely, but something that existed in the narrow passage between the two, where a man goes when he is afraid of the cost of the warmer thing. He helped Thomas with the ablative absolute, in a voice that was lower than his speaking voice by half a register. When he left, Henrietta found she could not remember the sentence she had been reading. He ordered firewood brought up to the morning room without being asked, after she mentioned, in no direction in particular, that her hands were stiff before noon. She mentioned it once. It was not mentioned again, but the wood arrived. He asked on a Tuesday afternoon in the East Corridor, where she was going with Thomas. And when she said the lower garden, he said, the east path ices over by midday, and turned and went back into his study. And she took the west path, and it did not ice over. None of it meant anything. She told herself this with some thoroughness. He had been married to Ilara, Duchess of Ashworth, who had died 4 years earlier in circumstances no one in the household discussed where Henrietta could hear, though she gathered from Betts's careful silences that the death had not been simple, and that Edmund's absence at the time had been the kind of absence a man never stops being unable to explain to himself. The portrait hung in the East Corridor, a woman of dark-eyed composure, painted in the year of her marriage, with a slight smile that was not quite happy and not quite sad, hovering somewhere in between. Henrietta walked past it every morning and every evening. She kept her eyes forward. The wound, when she came to understand it, arrived not in words, but in a moment she was not meant to see. Thomas had asked, one afternoon in the library, whether his guardian had ever had a child of his own. It was the kind of question 8-year-olds ask without any awareness of what they are striking. Henrietta had been across the room selecting a volume, and she had turned, half expecting the question to have been directed at her. It had not. Edmund was there, sitting at the far end of the long table with a quarterly report open in front of him, and the question landed on him the way a stone lands on water. He was absolutely still for 3 full seconds. Then he said, in a voice that was careful in the way of a man working against something that has weight, "I did not." He looked down at the quarterly report. After a moment he said, "There was a son. He did not live." Henrietta put the book back on the shelf. She did not look at Edmund. She walked to the window and watched the frost on the lower garden, and gave him what a woman of any decency gives a man. At the moment she understands the exact shape of what he carries. He had been away. Ilara had been brought to childbed at Ashworth without him. The child had not survived, and neither had Ilara. And Edmund Rayfield had arrived home to a house of sealed rooms and a portrait in the East Corridor, and a ward who looked at him with the eyes of someone who needed something he did not know how to provide. He had been punishing himself for 4 years by providing it badly. Henrietta understood this now, and it changed nothing about her situation. And it changed everything about the way she watched him cross a room. Lady Dorothea's campaign reached its height in the 3rd week of December, 8 days before the winter assembly. She had been building toward it in the methodical way of a general who believes in overwhelming force. Small strategic comments at dinner, a suggestion to Edmund that the spring would be a natural time to review the household arrangements, a pointed inquiry to Crane about the terms under which the companion post might be closed. None of it had produced the result she wanted, and it was this failure of ordinary pressure that drove her to the document. She produced it on a Thursday morning in the drawing room, before Edmund and Crane, and Henrietta was not meant to be present. She had come to the room to return a book she had borrowed from the library, having understood from Betts that the room was empty. It was not. She heard Lady Dorothea's voice before she opened the door, the particular carrying note of a woman making a point she expects to be agreed with. "This letter," Lady Dorothea said, and there was the sound of paper, "was found among Miss McCarthy's correspondence by my lady's maid. You will observe the direction. It is addressed to a Mr. Hartfield, who was formerly employed by the late Duchess's family. The content implies an arrangement by which the post was sought not through Crane's advertisement at all, but through family influence designed to place the woman inside this household." Henrietta stood in the corridor with her hand on the door handle and the book against her chest, and understood what was happening before she could stop the understanding. She had never written a letter to anyone named Hartfield. She had never, to her knowledge, heard the name before this moment. She opened the door. The three of them looked at her, Crane with professional blankness, Lady Dorothea with the settled expression of someone whose argument has just been interrupted at precisely the wrong moment, Edmund with nothing she could read. That, above all others, was the thing that struck her. She had learned, across 8 weeks at Ashworth, to read the small signals of his face, the way a careful reader learns to read a difficult text. And now, there was no signal. "I should like to see the letter," she said. "You have seen it already," Lady Dorothea said. "You wrote it." "I did not write it. Your handwriting is distinctive, Miss McCarthy. Crane may attest to it." Crane, to his credit, said only, "I have not yet examined the hand." She looked at Edmund. He was looking at the letter. She said, "I came to this post through your solicitor's advertisement in the September Gazette. I have never communicated with anyone in the late Duchess's family. I do not know a Mr. Hartfield." Edmund said nothing. He was still looking at the letter. She waited. The fire crackled. Somewhere upstairs. Thomas's footsteps crossed the nursery floor in the quick, unpredictable pattern of a child practicing something athletic indoors. She waited until the silence had told her everything it was going to tell her. "I will need 2 hours to pack my things," she said. "I can be at Carwell by nightfall." She had managed to be all the way to the door before she stopped. She stopped not because she expected him to speak, but because she had one more thing to say, and she would say it, or she would spend the rest of her life wishing she had. She turned back. "I sat with Thomas through his fever because he needed someone to sit with him, and there was no one else. I have walked 12 miles of ground around this house and memorized which paths ice in the morning. And I have made him read Latin because he said no one had ever asked him to try hard at anything. I did not come here through any arrangement except the advertisement in the Gazette, and I did not stay through any calculation except that the child needed staying with. I am sorry that you cannot tell the difference." She walked out of the drawing room and up the stairs. She packed with the careful economy of someone who has packed in grief before, and knows how to be efficient about it. The winter mantle, the 2 working dresses, the botanical essays, the small miniature portrait of her father that she carried in the inner pocket of her traveling case, worn soft at the edges from handling, his face smiling in the slightly awkward way of a man who was kind and could never quite make the kindness look natural. She set the traveling case by the door and sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at the window. Outside, snow had begun. She had not noticed it starting. It came in small, precise flakes, the kind that fell straight. because there was no wind yet, and the grounds of Ashworth were receiving it in silence. The lower garden was disappearing under it. The East Path flagstones were going white. She watched it for a while and thought about the 12 miles to Carwell, and whether the carriage could manage it in a snowfall, and whether she would cry on the journey, and whether she would permit herself to cry, or whether she would hold the miniature and be sensible. She thought she would probably permit it. She was 23, and she had been sent away before. But she had never been sent away from a place that had become, in 8 weeks, a place she would not be able to stop thinking about. She picked up her traveling case and went downstairs. The winter assembly had been planned by Lady Dorothea for the 3rd Friday of December, a gathering of the neighborhood's 30-odd notable families, and whatever of the county set could be persuaded to make the journey, with dancing in the Great Hall and a supper room opened in the East Wing. Henrietta had understood that she would not be a guest at it, but rather a piece of furniture in it, present if Thomas required managing, invisible otherwise. She had understood this, and had considered it merely the practical condition of her position. She had not understood that Lady Dorothea would use it as the occasion for a third, public voicing. But Lady Dorothea was not finished with her leverage. The assembly had brought 30 people into Ashworth, most of them people who had known Edmund since his father's time, and Lady Dorothea had spent the first hour of the evening speaking to each of them in the particular way she had of planting information so that it appeared to grow from consensus rather than from a single determined source. By the time Henrietta came down with Thomas, who had been invited to watch the dancing from the gallery for 1 hour before bed, the room already knew there was a question about the companion's credentials. She heard it from Mrs. Caldwell, the rector's wife from Ashton Parish, who spoke to her neighbor in the supper room with no apparent awareness that Henrietta was 3 feet away. "The rumor is there was a letter," Mrs. Caldwell said. "Some connection to the late Duchess's family that was not disclosed. Of course, I cannot say whether there is truth in it, but one does wonder why a woman in that position would have stayed as long as she did, if not for reasons of her own." Henrietta set down her glass and walked to the edge of the great hall and stood watching the dancing. Her face was arranged in an expression she had worn many times before, and she knew exactly how much effort it cost. Thomas, at her side, said, "Miss McCarthy, are you all right?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "You look like you do when you are doing a hard sum." She looked at him. His face was turned up to hers with the straightforward concern of a child who has not yet learned to pretend not to notice things, and she felt the weight of the evening shift slightly on its axis. She said, "Go and watch the dancing. I will be here." He went. She stood. The room was bright with candlelight and the smell of beeswax and pine boughs, and the musicians in the gallery were playing a country dance, and the 30 people of the county moved through it in their patterns, and she was at the edge of all of it in a gown that was neat and plain and 3 seasons old, and she was leaving in the morning, and the snow was still falling outside the tall windows, and none of it was going to matter, and she knew that, and she stood there anyway. She did not see Edmund cross the room. She understood he was crossing it only because the crowd parted. 30 people who had been moving in their patterns, and then a stillness that ran through the room like cold air through an open door, and the crowd opened. And he was walking toward her with the focused deliberateness of a man who has made a decision and is now executing it before the decision has time to reconsider itself. He stopped 2 feet in front of her. The room was entirely quiet. She held herself very still. He said in a voice that carried to every corner of the great hall, "I examined the letter this afternoon. The hand is not yours." She did not speak. "The paper bears a watermark from the Vane family's London stationer," he said. "Crane has confirmed it." From across the room, Crane gave a small, precise nod. Lady Dorothea's fan, which she had been holding at the measured height of a woman entirely in command of the situation, came down 3 inches. Edmund said, and she would hear this sentence for the rest of her life, "Miss McCarthy came to Ashworth on her own merits, and she will remain at Ashworth as my wife. If she will have a man who was 3 hours too slow in reading a letter he should have read the moment it was put in front of him." There was a long silence that was not silence so much as the sound of 30 people simultaneously deciding what they thought. It was the kind of silence that precedes a permanent rearrangement. Lady Dorothea said, very quietly, "Edmund." She said it with the particular note of a woman who has just understood that the script she has been following does not have the ending she planned for it. It was the note, Henrietta thought, of a woman who might, given time and privacy, recognize her error. Not a note of malice, a note of displacement. Edmund did not look at his mother. He was looking at Henrietta. She was aware of her hands. She was aware of the precise measurement of 2 feet of air between his coat and the front of her plain gown. She was aware of Thomas, in the gallery above, who had gone very still in the way of a child watching something he does not entirely understand, but feels the importance of. She said, "You were considerably more than 3 hours slow." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. "The first approach of one," he said. "I was." She said, "Thomas will need to be consulted." He said, "I have already consulted Thomas." He said, and I am quoting him precisely, that it was about time. She breathed. Outside, the snow was falling on the grounds of Ashworth, in the calm, straight way of snow that means to stay. The fire in the great hall's hearth crackled against the cold. The musicians, after the briefest uncertain pause, began to play again, and the 30 people of the county found, one by one, something to talk about that was not what had just happened, because what had just happened was settled and did not require any further discussion from them. Cecily Vane, at Lady Dorothea's side, looked at her hands. She had the expression of someone who had been told their entire life they were the correct answer and had just encountered a question the answer did not fit. Lady Dorothea turned and walked from the room. It was not a dramatic exit. It was the quiet withdrawal of a woman who needed a moment and would take it privately, which was, Henrietta thought, the most dignified thing she had done all evening. Crane, moving through the crowd with the professional ease of a man who has been present at many decisive moments and has learned to document them without disturbing the quality of the air, found Henrietta's elbow and said at low volume, "I will have the paperwork in order by Monday, Miss McCarthy. The arrangement is entirely within His Grace's authority, and the terms I can draw up will reflect the proper settlement of your position. You have my congratulations." "Thank you," she said. "And thank you for confirming the watermark." "I confirmed it," Crane said, "at approximately 2 o'clock this afternoon, when His Grace requested I look at it immediately." He paused. He had been looking at it since just after you left the drawing room. She looked across the room at Edmund, who was now speaking to Thomas, who had come down from the gallery in the particular hushed excitement of a child whose plan has just succeeded. Thomas was talking rapidly and gesturing at the dancing, and Edmund was listening with the expression she had seen once, briefly, in the doorway of the nursery at 5 in the morning, the expression that existed in the narrow passage between grief and warmth, except that it was shifting now, slowly and visibly, toward one side of the passage. She watched him listen to Thomas and understood that this was also what she had stayed for, though she had not known it at the time. On a morning that might be placed, with confidence, somewhere in the warmer half of January, when the worst of the snow had eased off, and the lower garden was showing pale green through the white. Henrietta stood at the window of the room that was now her own, at the front of the house. With the winter light across the floor and a cup of tea in her hand, and the miniature of her father on the writing desk behind her. Thomas was at his Latin in the morning room below. She could hear the occasional sound of a pencil being put down with emphasis when he disagreed with a declension. The east corridor was quiet. Edmund had turned Alara's portrait to face the wall the morning after the assembly, without ceremony, without explanation, with no word said to anyone. Henrietta had seen it on her way to breakfast and had not mentioned it. She thought she understood the act. It was not a gesture of erasure. It was the gesture of a man who had been standing in the corridor facing something for 4 years and had at last decided to turn toward a different direction, which was not the same thing as forgetting the corridor had a past. Alara's grief was real. Edmund's culpability, as he carried it, was real, even where it was not entirely warranted. But the portrait facing the wall meant that he had begun to understand that a man may carry a wound and still choose to walk forward, and this seemed to her as good a beginning as any. The fire in the hearth behind her was the kind of fire that is properly settled and does not require attention. She listened to it, and to Thomas's pencil, and to the small sound of the house finding its ordinary rhythm. And she looked at the grounds, where the East Path flagstones were still patched with white in the shadowed places, and the West Path was clear. Edmund came to stand beside her at the window. She had heard his footstep in the corridor, and known it without looking. He did not say anything for a long moment. He stood where she stood and looked at what she looked at. And the morning light was the kind of light that is honest about things, which is to say, it was not flattering. But it was clear, and in it she thought they must look from any distance, like two people who had arrived at a place separately and were choosing to stay together. He said quietly, "Thomas has requested a dog." "He has requested a dog since the 2nd week of November," she said. "I have been holding the line." I told him yes. She turned to look at him. He was watching the grounds with the faint, deliberate expression of a man who has made a small, irrevocable decision and is prepared to defend it. "A large one," he added. She faced the window again. She was not, absolutely not, smiling. Her reflection in the cold glass, she noted with some displeasure, was smiling. The snow fell in small quantities now, more like a thought of snow than the thing itself. And the grounds of Ashworth received it as they received everything, with patience and without surprise. And the fire crackled. And the miniature of her father stood on the desk in the room she had claimed from a house that had tried to send her away, and upstairs Thomas had given up arguing with the ablative absolute and was making, by the sound of it, a reasonably successful attempt at the dative. And the morning was entirely ordinary, which was the only kind of morning she had ever truly wanted. If this story found you at the right moment, leave a word below. Stories like Henrietta's are worth telling slowly, and this channel has more of them waiting for you.